So let's talk about attunement and learning to attune to ourselves, especially if we never got any consistent experiences of attunement in the first place. So again, a lot of these videos I've been making of late were inspired by having lots of conversations recently in person with survivors about their experiences. And I recently had a conversation with someone who had very clearly narcissistic parents, a father whose needs took absolute primacy over everyone's in the family system, and the entire family was organized around this guy. And then a mother who was in chronic distress about the father's infidelity and whose moods were dictated by basically how her marriage was going on any given day, and who would lash out at her children when they asked anything of her. So the children were either somewhat dissociated, or the children had to serve as her therapist and anticipate the mother's needs and the mother's fragility and basically cut their father, who was scary, a wide berth, even though they also craved his attention, and only when it was convenient for him. And because it was so rare to even get a moment with this father, because he was so busy and so important, no matter what they were doing, if he showed any interest in giving them time or attention, they would literally stop what they were doing to grab up those few fleeting moments. When a child has a narcissistic parent or parents, they make endless accommodations so they can get their basic psychological and emotional needs met, even if that means them having to interrupt their flows as children. And I've said this in prior videos. It can mean that the child of the narcissistic person, of a narcissistic parent, is literally the most flexible person in the room. They are so savvy at accommodation in any situation, and they can go with the flow like nobody else. But all of this comes at a tremendous cost. But a survivor of narcissistic parents who is out of that phase of dysregulation or numbness, let me tell you this, you folks get stuff done. You're efficient, you're flexible, because you had to be to get very fundamental survival needs met. Now, this video comes to me, though, interestingly. I was inspired mostly by this because I had had a long day of phone meetings the other day, one after the other after the other. In one of the meetings, we're probably about halfway, maybe 2/3 of the way through, and the person's child came into their home or came into the room. I wasn't sure. It was a phone call. I couldn't see. The person on the phone asked if we could pause for a moment, but they didn't mute themselves, so I could hear what was happening. And the person got off the phone and was completely attuned to their child. They asked the child how they were doing. They greeted the child with love and warmth and used endearments to talk to the child. The questions the adult asked were showing that they were clearly listening to the child. The child was young and responded with a cheerful and chirpy voice. And then the person on the phone said, "Hey, Ramani, can we put a pin in this and continue this later? I just want to stay attuned to my child for now." And I said, "Of course, no problem." And I was glad to have the time, frankly. And when I got off the phone, I was actually struck because then I started like, I paid attention to my body because I had a sort of wobbly feeling. And I sat with it, as I do, and I was like, this feels like grief. And I'm sure at some deep level for myself, because this never would have happened the way I grew up. One of my parents demanded all obedience all the time and never attuned. And the other parent, who was actually relatively attuned, was exhausted from always having to attend to that other parent. Intellectually, as a psychologist, as a mother, and as a human being, I was absolutely thrilled for this child and really happy for the parent I was on the phone with. But the emotions that cascaded for me, and I recognized for the people I talked to every day, I had a mix of them. It was almost like a grief, shame, and a sense of, will any of us who have ever been through this ever feel normal? And then I wondered, what will life be like for a child who feels important enough that a parent would actually end their call and turn their attention toward the child? To be frank with you, I got to tell you, I'm not fully sure about the answer to that question. I actually went through a quick mental survey of every client and a lot of friends I have, and I don't think it's happened to any of them. So one hypothesis is that people, maybe who got that level of attunement from a parent, never go to therapy and don't become friends with people like me, because I don't know. Now, I hope life is wonderful, and I anticipate it would be for that child, and I really commend that parent who prioritized her. I would imagine that this child will have a healthy sense of self, healthy emotional regulation, won't feel the need to prove themselves in a relationship, will never feel that they have to read someone else's mind, won't view human beings as unsafe, untrustworthy, and learn to stop trusting themselves. I'm not fully confident, though, that this child will be narcissist resistant. She will have a far greater likelihood of being narcissist resistant than someone who came from a narcissistic family because she'll have supports. She will have learned to trust herself, but who knows? Because we actually do know that people who come from happy, healthy family systems are vulnerable to getting stuck in narcissistic relationships because everybody likes charm, charisma, confidence, and all that stuff. And then they are actually raised to believe that communication works and that there's the potential for goodness and change in people. So the mechanism of stuck is different for people who come from happy families. But what is less likely to happen for her is that self-loathing trauma-bonded pattern that folks who have this as a legacy pattern face. I also hope that this child who was so attuned to is able to attune to others when she is older. I believe that empathy begets more empathy, but we'd rather that than the, I don't understand what you're saying to me. What do you mean you're having problems with your family or your relationship? I love my family. Maybe you aren't trying hard enough to talk to them. I mean, only time will tell. I've seen it go both ways with people who come from happy family systems. None of these paths are ever simple or clear or deterministic, right? An hour later, I still felt that sense of grief, but it was no longer for myself. Like, I'm too old. That ship has sailed. But I recognized that the grief was for all survivors because no survivor of a narcissistic relationship was ever going to get this. There are no do-overs for childhood. And I also felt sad because I know I didn't always hit these marks with my children. I did my best, but I was still healing. And I know there were times I remained distracted as I tried to be as perfect as possible in other areas of my life and may not have put down the phone to attune to my child. I'm actually better at it now, but they aren't small anymore. We hope it improves as our narratives about what happened to us become clearer. But when I thought of every survivor, all the survivors I have ever talked with, it's not only that utter lack of attunement that one experiences when they grow up with a narcissistic parent, but the abuse and the rejection of anything that made the child the child. The child's needs, the child's hopes, the child's interests. The narcissistic parent is not interested in comforting a scared or anxious child or reassuring them or putting their needs secondary to the child's needs. Never. And the other parent in these scenarios, even if they're not narcissistic, they're still navigating a horrible landscape. So it takes that other parent a minute too. So the child is caught in the landscape of one parent catering to the narcissistic parent's needs to appease them, often dissociated from the whole mess for a while. And then, once that kind of gets addressed, will sometimes attune to the child. And sometimes it's enough so that a child in the circumstance feels loved, but the child may also feel confused and guilty, knowing that their non-narcissistic parent suffered, but also knowing that their non-narcissistic parent wasn't always there for them the way they needed to be. I imagine that sweet kid I heard on the phone having wings instead of weights on her back, that the world seemed safe and happy to her, that her weekends were something to be looked forward to, and that she knows she is valued and cherished. All of that clears the deck so that child can feel safe and not always be hyper-vigilantly monitoring the environment, waiting and wondering about the next psychological explosion, but rather can focus on the all-important work of just being a kid. None of us get do-overs. At the best of it, we can try and do this for ourselves, for our inner child. And what does that look like? Maybe all that we need to do is learn to talk to ourselves now as we should have been talked to in the first place. Like that parent I overheard on the phone. Take a minute and check in with ourselves. Be interested in ourselves. I actually believe mindfulness may simply be reparenting, being the attuned parent that most of us didn't consistently get, especially if we came from a narcissistic family of origin. I can't turn the clock back for every survivor and let them have even one parental experience like that little kid on the phone probably gets every day. But I can encourage you to do this for yourself now. You deserved it then, but life isn't fair, and you didn't get it then. You still deserve it now. And we can't always trust that the world will give it to us. But as part of healing, we can find ways to be this for ourselves. And if we think of this big amorphous word called mindfulness as simply being the attuned parent for ourselves, the parent who points out, look at that bee over there, or pays attention while we play the game with them, whatever it is, if we can attune to ourselves. No, it's not a do-over, but it's a start. And it's a way we can harness tools like mindfulness to remind ourselves that we are, in fact, important. Thanks again.